That time I got reincarnated as a true dragon by NautyManu. Chapter 76. This time you shall die to my blade. Veldanava quickly used Shunpo to evade Silvan's attack. He then appeared behind Silvan, swinging his sword at Silvan's arms. However, due to Silvan's rich combat experience and lightning enhancing his reflexes, he managed to dodge to the side and retaliate with his sword swung in an arc. Veldanava then used Shunpo again to get away from his attack. This went on for a couple of minutes where each of them used their speed to try to injure the other party. The rest of the soldiers could only see their afterimages as they were too fast for the naked eye to follow. The deadlock was finally broken when Veldanava managed to outsmart Silvan and injured his abdomen. His sword was covered in stellar mana, making Silvan's lightning armor useless. You see, in a game of cat and mouse chase, the key to victory lies in each other's patience and cunningness. And in both aspects Veldanava has Silvan beat by a large margin. So when Silvan's restlessness was at its peak, Veldanava surprised him with this stellar mana. Silvan clutched his bleeding wound and clicked his tongue. He could feel that his magic resistance is no use against Veldanava's stellar mana, which is correctly devouring his insides. He could only temporarily suppress it with his aura. But apart from the wound in his abdomen, Veldanava managed to injure something more significant in him. His pride was injured. Before meeting Veldanava, Silvan was hailed as the fastest swordsman in the eastern continent. Even against Rudra he was superior in this aspect. But today a no-named nobody managed to injure him while also having speed similar or far exceed him, and to top it all, Silvan didn't manage to land a single injury on Veldanava. This is too humiliating for him. You shall pay, he growled as he used his unique skill to the maximum extent. Lightning danced around him. The ground cracked at the pressure he was releasing. His eyes were filled with heavy killing intent as he gazed at Veldanava. This time you shall die to my blade. Saying so, he disappeared into a trail of lightning. The second round has begun. But in this round Veldanava was being cornered very quickly. After his attack failed to finish off Silvan earlier, he lost the advantage he had. And he couldn't really use stellar mana that much. Coating his weapon is the best he could do at his current situation. I need another opening, Veldanava thought with a grim expression. He wondered whether to use true dragon magic. But using that type of magic would also deal damage to him. As true dragon magic isn't something anyone could casually do. Especially for Veldanava with his current state. But his dilemma was quickly slowed after a few rounds of clashing. Silvan, who was once a bit overwhelmed by his swordsmanship, began to slowly predict his attacks. With his lightning enhancing his reflexes and thought processes, he was slowly comprehending Veldanava's swordsmanship. Although his strength may be a bit lacking compared to Rudra, but Silvan is still one of the strongest humans who are alive. So he is a genius in his own right. Although he couldn't fully comprehend Veldanava's swordsmanship, he could still see a pattern. HMPH, as I thought, this bastard is only this much. He is nothing but a weak human with some swordsmanship. How could he be deserving of my Lucia? Silvan thought arrogantly. As more time progressed, the situation began to grow more tense. Silvan was cornering Veldanava by each passing second. And slowly injuries began to appear in Veldanava's body. Although these injuries are only flesh wounds, Veldanava was in a bit of a panic. One of his greatest cards was slowly being turned to useless. If he didn't do something now, he would lose this battle and his family would be in danger. Screw it, I'm taking the chance. I will just hope my body would handle the recoil, he thought as he began to gather stellar mana in his body. True dragon magic star cannon, Veldanava shouted as he stretched his hands towards Silvan and unleashed a magic cannon directly at him. Due to the attack traveling at the speed of light, Silvan wasn't able to react until the attack was in front of him. He hastily jumped to the side, narrowly evading the magic blast, but even so his left arm was completely obliterated by it. Veldanava, who saw the much-awaited he wanted, acted immediately. He ignored the bleeding in his arm and unleashed a sword technique. Divine Rupture, he shouted as he unleashed his technique. A sword slash made by condensing stellar mana and aura arrived at Silvan at breakneck speed. Since Silvan was already injured pretty badly by the previous attack, he couldn't defend by countering the attack with his own sword attack. Gritting his teeth, he did the only thing he could do at this moment. He used his remaining magicules and fortified his defense to the best he could. Then he, with his remaining willpower and battle intent, pushed his sword in front of him and tried to tank the attack. He gambled on the probability of his legend-grade sword being able to at least handle this. Unfortunately, he had underestimated the dangerousness of stellar mana. The reason why Milim was considered the destroyer wasn't because of her reputation of being the most chaotic demon lord. No, it is because of her stellar mana that destroyed everything in its track. As the second most destructive energy, stellar mana should never be underestimated. But unfortunately Silvan had no such knowledge. He just despaired when his sword began to crack as soon as it met with Veldanova's attack. He cried in despair as he was engulfed in the explosion. Veldana kneeled on the ground and leaned on his sword for support. Using true dragon magic, and that sword strike took a huge toll on him. But fortunately he was able to defeat his opponent. Thinking so, he got up and looked at the remaining soldiers with a cold, piercing gaze. "Now it is your turn." As he readied his sword again, his expression suddenly paused as he heard someone say, "I'm afraid that wouldn't be possible." Turning around, he saw Raven with back placed to the door, and in one of his hands was Milim. What infuriated Veldanova more was that Raven had placed a dagger dyed with fresh blood near Milim's neck. "If you value your daughter's well-being, I suggest you drop your weapon and surrender yourself," Raven threatened with a cruel glint flashing through his eyes. Chapter 77. A Mother's Determination. Earlier, when Raven and his squad entered, they found that house was eerily quiet. Due to their earlier encounters, Raven decided to stay cautious and commanded his men to tread with caution. So they slowly began to search the house, looking for any traces of the royal family. As they reached the back door, they found it open and with traces of someone running out of the house. Panic flashed across their eyes as they realized that people here had fled from this using this door. They hastily followed the trail to quickly catch their target. If their target managed to escape, all of their efforts would be wasted. In their hurry, they didn't realize one little crucial detail. Why was there such a deliberate trail when they found nothing in the whole house? Their ignorance was paid with a great piece as the place most of the men stood suddenly blown up in an explosion. If it was not for Raven at the last minute using his men as cover to shield him, he too would be seriously injured by that explosion. After the explosion subsided, only 3 men survived excluding Raven, and even then they're heavily injured. Looking at his dead men, Raven felt a huge anger in his heart. These men were his own team that he painstakingly cultivated. As someone who was hailed as a genius strategist, Raven knew that his strength alone isn't enough to survive in this world. That is why he created his own team that will act as his bodyguards and meat shields. But even when they were disposable paws, he couldn't bear to see them sacrificed without any benefits. "Find that bitch, she should be somewhere near here. Find her and capture her immediately. If she struggles, break her legs." Raven shouted his orders with a cold voice as he used his unique skill to take control over all of his remaining yeast. Soon the men rang into action, completely ignoring any pain they were feeling due to their actions. In their minds, they didn't register anything but Raven's orders. As soldiers, they need not think about anything but obey orders. "Wherever you are, I'm going to make you pay for what you did," Raven said with a ruthless glint in his eyes. In his madness, he completely forgot about his orders. His orders were to capture Lucia unharmed. The rebels are still feared Rudra's power, so they repeatedly recall their soldiers. They didn't want a crazy emperor coming at them. This is also the reason they sent both Raven and Silvan to capture her. The rebels know that Silvan has some affection for her, so he will not harm her. And even if his men were to ignore his orders, Raven with his unique skill would be able to stop them. He was their guarantee to mission success. But the rebels would have never thought that Raven, their trump card, would go crazy after seeing the death of his men. In the woods, Lucia was running with Milim strapped on her back. On her hand was the familiar staff that Rimuru gifted her. Although she couldn't use her magic, the staff could still be used as a weapon. Earlier, Lucia heard the sound of an explosion. She deduced it must have been the trap she set for the enemy. She only used that trap to disorientate the enemy and earn her some extra minutes to escape with Milim. As she was near the end of the anti-magic barrier, het combat instincts which were honed in her journey with her brother suddenly rang up. She rolled to the side to avoid a sharp object that flew past her. Looking around, she found a wounded man looking at her with an indifferent gaze. He looked like an assassin as he had 2 daggers on his hands. Lucia readied her staff. She knew she had no choice but to fight her way out. She isn't so naive to think her enemy would not kill her when she turns on her back to run. Furthermore, with Milim on her back, she doesn't have that option too. So conflict is inevitable. "I hope Velda is fine on his end," she thought before dashing at her enemy. 20 minutes later, Lucia huffed as she used her staff for support to stand up. She was very tired after fighting 3 men at the same time. Yes, 3 men. Apart from the assassin who found her, another 2 men suddenly appeared while they were fighting, and these guys had a frightening teamwork that made Lucia this exhausted. Normally Lucia could just use her martial arts to finish them all off without any problems, but these hateful guys always aimed for her back where Milim is. So Lucia had to be extra careful while also protecting Milim. Finally, it's over, she said as he wiped the sweat that was on her face. Oh, I wouldn't be so sure, came a cold voice making Lucia instantly tensed. From the bushes came Raven with his sword drawn. His eyes were overflowing with murderous intent that it scared little Milim. Shush now sweetie, mommy will protect you, so don't worry, okay? Lucia gently said as she tried her best to console her child. This seems to work as Milim slowly began to stop crying. She could instinctively feel her mother's overflowing love and care for her. This beautiful scene of mother and daughter was interrupted by Raven as he swung his sword with such agility that it left after images. He may not have the same speed as Silvan, but his skills are the top amongst them. Had it not been for her skill warning about the impending strike, Lucia may have been heavily wounded. Despite having an ultimate skill, she is unable to use it to its full extent due to her insufficient magicules. And she was never an active fighter to begin with. And unfortunately she began to accumulate wounds while she was fighting Raven. Furthermore, he, like his men, always targeted Milim on her back. But everything isn't hopeless. With each passing moment, Lucia was slowly adapted to Raven fighting style. If given enough time, Lucia can defeat Raven. Both parties knew this. This is why Raven decided to use one of his trump cards. Suddenly, one of the men who Lucia assumed to be dead sprang into action as he aimed his dagger at Milim. This action completely caught Lucia off guard. In a hurry, she used her staff to block the dagger and attack the man. Just as she was about to breathe a sigh of relief, she coughed a mouthful of blood. Looking at her body, she saw a sword coming out of her stomach. She looked behind her in despair, only to see Raven with a cold smile. She could helplessly lie on the ground as she was kicked by Raven. He then forcefully took Milim away from her. After kicking her a few more times, Raven left.